Okay, so it's been a while since we discussed UML. I wanted to wait until we had a few more of our lectures under our collective belts. And so now that we're there, it's time to go back and revisit our assignment on UML. Now, you should have by now taken a stab at this. And I know a few of you did. Thank you for that. Those of you that didn't, shame on you. I cannot give you feedback if you do not turn things in. Which means you only get one shot at it, whereas if you turn things in and give me a chance to review, I can tell you how to make corrections. So it is to your benefit to go ahead and turn things in. Even though they aren't due yet, I can give you feedback and hopefully tell you how to improve. All right, so let's look at our UML assignment. It's this Design a D&D Game assignment, and this is the UML portion of it. Now, there is an extension to this assignment. Once you make your UML diagram, you can actually go in here and make the program that it describes. I think that's under Programming Challenges or Programming Assignments at the bottom. D&D Character Generator. So you have this, right? So, I mean, you have the design for it. So you can just take your design and turn it into a program. And it's almost like double dipping, right? So let's go take a look at the first part of this. We'll go back and look at the requirements. So our profession is really all about requirements. So always review the requirements, figure out what the requirements are, do exactly what the requirements ask of you, and don't be tempted to run off and do a bunch of stuff that aren't in the requirements, because that isn't always a good thing. So the requirements for this one says that in this assignment, you'll create a UML model for an adventure game character. We'll be using the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons version 1 rule system. So we've already got a recorded lecture session for that. And I'm not interested in making this a test of your knowledge over Dungeons & Dragons. That's just a good starting point. And so this assignment doesn't really encompass everything that you could do with it, just enough to where we're going to meet our objective, which is for you to show me that you know how to make a UML diagram about a well-known, well-documented system. So just to review what we have to do here, it says you can use any tool capable of drawing a diagram. So I use Dia for this. This is what I showed you in class and in our previous demonstration, and I'm going to continue using that program. And it says you have to account for the following. Oh, it also says that if you don't want to use Dia, you can use whatever you want. So if you really want to use Illustrator, if you really want to use some other tool, I remember I took a graduate course in UML, and I wound up using Inkscape, which is sort of the freeware version, the open source version of Illustrator. I'm just picky about what things look like. That's just me. But that's not a requirement here. I'm not requiring you to make a pretty diagram. I'm requiring you to make an accurate diagram. All right, so that's fine. And if you really want to draw it on paper, you can do that too. Just scan it in and send it to me in some well-known image format that I can open in Photoshop or whatever. Okay, so beyond that, it says your diagram must account for the following. The software classes resulting from the UML diagrams must allow the programmer to create a player character. So remember, UML is like sheet music for programmers. You ought to be able to make a diagram, hand it off, and anyone competent in programming and competent in reading a diagram should be able to make whatever it is that you've specified. The character may be one of the following races, and this is an abbreviated list versus what's in the actual D&D game rules. So human, elf, dwarf, and gnome. So that's where we're going to start. How do we do that? And we've talked about this. We hadn't talked about this in the first go-around, but now we have. We've talked about enumerations. And an enumeration, if you remember, is a way of using an integer, but instead of it being 0, 1, 2, and 3, which would be hard to remember which one is the dwarf and which one is the human. Did I go in alphabetical order? Did I go in random order? It's just too hard to remember. So using numbers is a good idea and a bad idea at the same time. It's just too easy to make mistakes. So what we have in C# is something called enumerations, where we can use numbers, but those numbers have titles. And so we would be able to use an enumeration that says human, elf, dwarf, and gnome. C# will treat them as numbers, but we don't have to remember which number is which. And that's what an enumeration does for us. All right, so let's switch back over to our diagram. I'm going to start with a fresh one. And I'll create a class. If you don't remember how to do this, once you've launched Dia, the first thing you need to do is change this so that it's to the UML symbols. I think by default it probably comes in with the first one. And you want UML. And we only need a few of these, so we're going to use class diagram and just a few of these up here at the top. We're not going to need all of them. All right, so here's class, and I'll go ahead and open this up and make this a player character class. And I'll hit apply. So it's there, and the first thing in our requirements list is the race attribute, which is what we've been talking about, human, elf, dwarf, and gnome. So let's put race in here. Now UML doesn't have enum as a type because it's not really universal. Not every language supports enumerations. Many of them do, but not all of them do. So that's not really part of UML, but we can fake it. Remember, the most important thing about a document is that the person reading it ought to be able to read it. I know that sounds like a tautology, but that's what I'm presenting as your guideline. Unless you're in an actual graduate course on UML, nobody really cares whether or not you got the exact symbols right or not. The key to it is does the diagram communicate well enough to get your point across? And the other thing you have to remember is that by and large in UML diagrams, you're not always specifying types. So in this case, I think it makes sense to do this, specify a type, because it really speaks to what we want to do. So I'm going to type enum in here in the type. And then in my comment, I'm going to add what the 4 possibilities are. So I think this does a good enough job of communicating what we're after. Human, elf, dwarf, and gnome. So I'll say human, elf, dwarf, and gnome are the possibilities. And that's fine. Not strictly UML, but I think good enough to where we can communicate what we're after. In a lot of the UML diagrams I've worked with, we don't specify type at all, but I think I would rather you go ahead and specify the type for this stuff because it makes you think about the different types and how to use them. So that's a good exercise for us at this stage in our development. All right, let's see what else we need. So that takes care of that first requirement. All characters have a set of base attribute as described in the rules, such as character name, level, hit points, etc. You must account for these. So let's put a few of these in here. So we'll say name, which will be a string. Level, now this is going to be a little tricky, right? Level is going to be an integer, but it's also going to be a function of experience points. So we might want to consider implementing this as a property. Actually, this is probably all going to be properties, but in our property logic, we'll just say you might want to compute this from experience points, right? Because your level is depending on your experience points. The number of experience points that you have, if you're using the old school rules, they don't reset every time you achieve a new level. So if it's 10,000 experience points that get you from level 1 to level 2, then as soon as you have 10,001, then you're level 2, and then maybe it's 20,000 to get you to level 3. Well, that's not 20,000, that's 10,000 more. So you can take the total number of experience points and apply some mathematical calculation to it and arrive at the level, rather than having to store the level independently, because you're going to have to compute that anyway. So that's just something to think about. So from a UML standpoint, what I did was I just put it in the comments that that's the case. All right, so the next thing that we need, let's see what it says. It says character name, level, hit points, etc. Etc. is a little vague. And this won't be the last time you start with a vague requirement. Most requirements are vague, especially initial ones. So we'll put the ones that are in there because that would make sense. So hit points, that's definitely going to be an integer. And then it says, and that's all it says, character level, hit points, etc. So what are some of the etceteras? Armor class comes to mind. Experience points comes to mind because we discussed it. So we'll have that be an integer. And that's okay. I won't try to think of all of them, but as I think of more, then I can certainly add them. All right, and then the next part is the part that we discussed in class, which was the base attribute. Oh, those are the base attributes. And then, here's the class part. But we also talked about adding all of those basic attributes in. So let's do that while we're thinking about it. And this is what you should have completed already anyway. So you should have put in here strength, which is an integer, intelligence. And in the interest of time, I'm going to stop putting the type in. But you should go ahead and make those integers as well. So wisdom, dexterity, constitution, and charisma. Okay, so we're coming along nicely. We've got a growing diagram. Let's see what else it says. The character may be one of the following classes. So remember, fighter, magic user, cleric, and thief are the 4 that I've asked you for. There are more than that in the game, but those are the 4 that I've asked for. So those are the ones that you need to implement. Let's set that aside for a minute and scroll down a little bit. It says the character must have one of the following alignments. This looks like another possible enumeration. So why don't we go ahead and add that? And then you would come down here and add all the possibilities. Now that's quite a long list, so I'm just going to put the extremes. We'll put in lawful good. I would expect you to put all of them, but I'm just going to put the basics in, or the extremes. So the extremes would be lawful good, true neutral in the middle, and chaotic evil at the other end of the spectrum. Okay. Now we're to the point where you could have done all of this on your first pass. Now we're to the point where we need some of the things we've been talking about in some of our more advanced lectures. So how do we do fighter, magic user, cleric, and thief? Well, there's probably several ways you could do it, but what I suggest is that we use inheritance. So what we have is a player character that has all of the base attributes on it, and then we've got these other things, these other classes that have, they're literally classes, that have these additional attributes on them. So it says fighters have strength modifiers for encumbrance. This means that if a fighter has a strength of 18, then they also have a value between 0 and 100 to determine how the character fights while encumbered. All right, so let's do that. We'll make this class a fighter, and we'll add an attribute called encumbrance. It is an integer, and it will be between 0 and 100. All right, so now how do we make this fighter, how do we indicate that it's of a type player character? We do that with the inheritance marker, which is this broad-headed arrow here. The tooltip for it says generalization, and it says class inheritance right next to it, so that should probably be a good hint for you. We draw them backwards, so the arrow starts at player character and goes to fighter. So what this is saying is that fighter is a player character, which is what we want. And if you really wanted to go all the way on this thing, you could double-click player character and make it abstract, which means that you're not allowed to directly instantiate player character. You're only allowed to instantiate fighter. So there's no way to say character equals new character, this player character thing. You can't do it directly. You have to do it through fighter or one of the other classes. All right, so that one was pretty easy. Let's look at another one. Let's do thief, because that one is pretty well laid out for you. So we've got thief. So I'll add another class for thief. And the thief has some additional attributes as well. So hide in shadows, pick lock, spot traps, pickpocket, and backstab modifier. And those are all percentages. So again, between 0 and 100. So we'll put these in here. And I'll just put a few in here because you get the idea. You don't want to watch me type all of them. My personal favorite, the backstab modifier. Thieves get extra damage for attacking from behind. Apparently so do politicians. I just say that because it's an election year. Can't get up there. I'll just have to click. Make it an integer and make it 0 to 100. Okay, so you get the idea. Just add the rest of them in. And now we've got our thief, and we need to indicate that that is also a player character, so we'll draw our line like so. All right, so now you just need to do cleric and thief, or excuse me, cleric and magic user, and finish out thief. And I'm kind of leaving some of this to your imagination. So magic user and cleric, just kind of think it through and see what you think it should be. There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. I just want to see if you can think about it, come up with some things, and add them to the diagram. All right, so what's the next part? It says the player must have an inventory. Everyone has a normal inventory for books, weapons, etc. Magic users need an inventory for spells. Clerics need an inventory for spells as well, but their spells are different. Magic users get their spells from studying, and clerics get them from praying. So they're different kinds of spells and different names and different all of that, but I think what you need to figure out is how different are they? Is there a way to make them different such that they need their own classes? Or can you make a base class and use it twice? Or this is the design part that I want you to figure out. And again, there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. You just have to come up with a good idea and be able to diagram it. All right, so let's do the inventory part. We couldn't do this before because we had not talked about collections. And I don't think we had talked about composition either. So you need both of those things to make an inventory system. So what we'll do is we'll create an attribute on here called inventory, which will be a collection. I'll just make it iList, which is an interface to lists. I can essentially at this stage use anything that implements iList, or I could even do IEnumerable if I wanted to. It's a good idea to go with interfaces whenever you can, because that makes it less explicit. That gives the programmer more room to decide what they want. And this is really why we usually don't put types on here at all. But in this exercise, I want you thinking about them. All right, so this one's going to be an IEnumerable, and what's going to go inside of it. We've talked about collections and we've talked about generic collections. And so now we're qualified to talk about what we're going to put in here. And in this case, it's going to be something that we haven't made yet. So I'm going to make a class called inventory item, and I'm going to say that our inventory is going to be some sort of collection that implements enumerable, which is pretty much all of them. Your lists, array lists, these aren't simple arrays, these are the more complicated ones. And so we're going to use all of those features in C# to really make this nice. And then we're going to fill it with inventory items. So let's go ahead and apply that. And now we need to make the inventory item class. So let's make that. And just a few attributes come to mind. Every inventory item is going to have a weight. It's going to have a gold value. And it's going to have a name. Probably should have put name first. And then maybe a long description. And I'll move the name and description up, because that just seems like the right thing to do. All right, now we need to indicate that inventory item is a component of our inventory, and we do that with composition. So remember, composition can be summarized. It's drawn with this sort of diamond-tipped arrow thing. And you can summarize it by saying has a. So the player inventory has a inventory item, or has an inventory item would be correct grammar, but it's has a. And then on these, usually what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to set the multiplicity on it. So multiplicity is, it describes the relationship from one to the other. So what I'll do is I'll put 1 on side A. I'll probably get this backwards, and put many on the other side. And I did get them backwards. Oh no, I didn't. That's right. So 1 inventory item. There's 1 inventory with many inventory items in it, is what that's saying. And the correct way to do this is to use an infinity symbol, but that's kind of hard to type. So if you really want to do that, you can go look up infinity symbol. You can tell I do this from time to time because it was right there. I just come in here, copy it, bring it back over here, and paste it in. And then you might want to make that bigger. I'll let you fiddle around with fonts and things like that to make it larger. You can do it this way. There's another way you can do it. You can put it this way, and I've seen this done in diagrams as well, so that they're right next to each other, although I think I prefer them on the other end. But that's okay. So you need some way to indicate the multiplicity. So it's going to be 1 to many, many to many, 1 to 1. Those are the most common ones. So if you have lots of things in here, it's possible that you may only have 1 thing in here. So if you did some sort of object where it was 1 to 1, maybe you have left hand and right hand weapon, and a weapon is a specialized object. Well, you can only hold 1 at a time in each hand, so left hand and right hand might be 1 to 1. So those are the most common ones. I suspect you will find 1 to many probably the most useful and the most used. All right, so that's inventory item, and I think that describes an inventory reasonably well. The next thing that you would need to do according to our assignment is you need to figure out how magical items and magical things like spells and stuff like that is gonna be handled. And where do we put that? Do we put it directly on the class? Do we put it on the player character? Where do you want to put it? It's all up to you. This is the challenge of your design experiment or your design assignment. All right, so what's the last thing it says? Be sure to turn in your diagram as some sort of image format or PDF, or if you're using Dia, you can turn in the Dia file. So that's what I would do. So I'll do this. I'll do save as. And what else does it say? It says you need to turn it in and name it according to the naming conventions for the class. And that's pretty straightforward. I don't really have a hard, fast rule on what it should be. I do have expectations as to what it will be in it. So I expect you to put your name on it. So I'm going to call mine by my name. And I'm going to say spring 2016 so that I know what it's from. I could probably figure that out. But definitely you want your name in there. And then some indication of what this is. So the name of this assignment is Design Assignment. Design a D&D game. So I'll call this Design D and D game. I don't think I can put an ampersand in a file name. Okay, but I can do all of that. And I'm going to put mine on my desktop so that I can find it easily. And then it says you're supposed to zip it. I do believe. No, it doesn't say that, so you don't have to zip it if you don't want to. All right, and then from here you would just go turn in that file. But make sure it has your name on it and some indication of what it is. So if I don't make that stipulation, what I get is, 20 files all named the same thing. And what happens is I come in here and I download them, and I usually download them, all of them at the same time so that I can just go through and grade them. Well, if everybody has the same file name, I can't tell whose is whose. Another thing you might consider doing, I don't know why I didn't think of this till just now, you can come in here and put your name on it. So just click the text thing. And it's super tiny, I guess. It's not letting me do it. Oh, here it is. I'm clicking the wrong thing. Here we go. So you can put your name on it like this. Use Bruce Van Horn, Spring 2016, and then we'll call it Dungeons and Dragons Design Assignment. That's good enough. So again, it doesn't have to be exact. I just have to be able to figure out what it is and who it belongs to. Okay, so I'll save that, and then I would turn that in, and you can move that up here if you would rather. And that's pretty much it. So now you should have enough insight to figure out how the rest of this should go. And as usual, if you have any questions, call, write, send smoke signals, whatever it is you need to do, and I will certainly help you with it.